It's time now for the political analysis of Fromm and Fuller. Al Fromm, former political advisor to President Bill Clinton, and Craig Fuller, former political advisor to both President Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush. Good morning, all. Craig, a couple of weeks ago, as we were talking about Joe Biden's leadership or lack thereof with this crisis in Ukraine, we brought up your old boss, and during the first Iraq war, during that particular time in our history, George Bush was scoring somewhere in the area of 90% approval rating. And we all know that that went down, but it is stunning to me to see Joe Biden, who in many ways is getting some pretty good credit for his handling and building a coalition to help the Ukrainians, is still stuck around 40. I mean, what gives on all that?
Yeah. Dave, it's an interesting question. I delved into it as well after our last discussion. I come down to two big differences. The nation is in a very different frame of mind, maybe different place than it was with George Herbert Walker Bush today. And these are very different wars. So let's take the battles or the wars first. The invasion of Kuwait by Saddam Hussein in Iraq was clearly seen as a horrible moment, a horrible event. President George Herbert Walker Bush was very clear with his message that this will not stand. It happened in August. And it wasn't until January that the military action that was so successful occurred. So there were a number of months that went by, but Bush was building an incredible coalition. Biden has done a similar thing by holding NATO together, but Bush had a very aggressive effort going, as people will recall, with Jim Baker as Secretary of State. Brent Scowcroft was his national security advisor. Dick Cheney was at the Defense Department. I mean, it was a seasoned team that had a great deal of White House and executive branch experience and international experience building a coalition. And then, of course, Colin Powell's message of having an overwhelming force was adhered to, and several 100,000 Americans went there for what became a short and successful effort. Very different than where we are today with Ukraine, where we're by design, and I think wisely, trying to avoid a shooting conflict with Russia and supporting Ukraine, but not really able to go in and claim victory. And as we've discussed before, the metrics around what success looks like are kind of out of Biden's hands in many ways, although the success of holding and building a strong NATO, I think, is something that's going to be long lasting and very significant. With the nation, President George Herbert Walker Bush came into office with an approval rating just over 60%. That's what Reagan left with. He kind of inherited that. It actually climbed steadily over the first months of his presidency. And as you say, it hit nearly 90%, which is an extraordinary peak. Actually, exceeded, if you look at the CBS poll, by only 1 point. And Bush was at 80, George Herbert Walker Bush was at 89, and George W. Bush was at 90 at the height of his approval ratings. And to put that into perspective, Kennedy's highest rating of his presidency was 83%. Nixon's highest rating was 67%. So the nation is just now clearly more divided. And Obama's highest rating was 69%. Trump's highest rating was 49%. The recent presidents have just been unable to gain the kind of support that past presidents have. So I don't think it's a surprise that Biden's number is not rising as rapidly as George Herbert Walker Bush's did. He deserves credit for much, but ultimately it's the outcome of this conflict that's going to determine how people ultimately view the Biden administration's engagement.
Al, what's your take on this?
Well, I basically agree with a lot of what Craig said. I mean, I'll make 4 quick points. First, these are very different wars. Second, as Craig said, the country was much less polarized you can't get to 90% unless you win support of voters of both parties. And today, a substantial block of both parties won't support a president of the other party. But third, Biden's numbers on the war are really a reflection of his larger standing, his overall standing with voters. And fourth, Bush's 90% or 89% proved to be a loss leader. When the country turned back to domestic issues, they plummeted significantly. Look, if we had 425,000 troops on the ground in Ukraine as we did in Kuwait, if the war was the #1 issue on Americans' minds, if we had a congressional authorization, and if we drove the Russians out in a month with less than 250 American deaths and had a clear path to Moscow, I suspect Biden's numbers would be a lot higher than they are now, much closer to 90%. My guess is they'd be about 70% because about a quarter to a third of voters just won't support anything that a president of the other party does. I'd say 70 is the new 90. But as we've said for months on Fromm and Fuller, and as I wrote in the SPY before the war, to improve his standing, Biden needs to rein in his left, and he needs to get right with the voters on inflation and crime. Most Americans probably agree with Biden's position on the war. Most want to see Ukraine win. They're horrified by what they see on television. They think Biden said all the right things. His speech last weekend in Warsaw was widely praised. But the question does remain, if the stakes are as high as he says they are, why we're not doing more, or why we're not delivering planes to the Ukrainians, why we're not getting them every weapon they want. The truth is we might be doing it and we just don't know. But the reality is the war is not the main concern of American voters. Polling over the weekend by NBC showed that inflation and the economy in general were much more important than the war. Most people are concerned about the price of food and the cost of a gallon of gas. In 1992, and 92, when the glow of the victory in Iraq wore off, and people's attention again turned to the economy, Bush found out that an 89% approval rating can go away pretty quickly. By the time Clinton was nominated 17 months later, it was down to 29%. And by election day, in the only poll that really counts, it was under 38%, which is much closer to where Biden is today.
I want to switch channels a little bit and talk about an article I read in the Washington Post over the last day, and it had to do with Hunter Biden. And it was extraordinary to me to see, for example, the legitimacy of this lost laptop, a much more serious effort on the part of mainstream media to take these concerns that Republicans have brought up for several months. And, you know, I guess it just adds to President Biden's challenges if, in fact, there's a serious case that his son should be indicted. Al, what's your thoughts?
When I looked at that story, it also made it clear that President Biden wasn't involved in any way. You know, obviously, when the family gets in trouble, it's not a good thing. But Lord knows that President Trump survived an awful lot of misbehavior by his kids. I don't know. I guess I just think in the end, you know, it's not going to help Biden. But if Biden wants to improve his standing, as I said before, let's get inflation right. Let's get the inflation rate down. You know, let's get serious about pushing that 100,000 cops. And he has to reassert control over his party and bring it to the political center. I think that's much more important than what happens to Hunter Biden. You know, there was, and again, I mean, I certainly, I certainly don't condone anything that Hunter Biden might have done, but I guess I don't think it's one of the great. I mean, relatives of presidents have always tried to take advantage of their presidency or high office in the case of Hunter Biden, because Biden is vice president. But in the end, Biden will be judged on his own merit.
Just as a follow-up, though, Al, I mean, beyond the culpability or not of Hunter, was this kind of, I think a lot of people might be very frustrated that mainstream media, journalists did not take this as seriously as they should have. Maybe you have a different point of view.
Let's put things in perspective. You had a president in office who basically supported the Russians, supported Putin, who had his administration, as we are finding out now, his main effort was to subvert democracy and steal an election, overturn the will of the voters. What Hunter Biden did is awful, but or may have done is awful, but it doesn't even compare in the least to the damage to our country that Trump and his gang did, with the Republican Party complicit. I mean, I don't see Democrats out there saying Hunter Biden's the greatest guy in the world and we don't care what he did. But we've had 2 years of, or at least, you know, of the Republicans being complicit with Trump's effort, or at least not speaking up, with Trump's effort to undermine democracy, and the two members of the Republican Party in the Congress who have spoken up have been censured essentially by their colleagues. I think we're just on two different playing fields.
Craig, what was your take? I mean, I don't know if you saw the article I brought up, but it is interesting how this story has now reemerged and the impact it might have on President Biden.
You know, I did see the article. I don't. There's a little bit of deflection here. I don't suggest the issues that Al is raising aren't important, but I think the Hunter Biden story is probably one with legs. A very good friend of mine, who became a friend when we served together in the White House, David Gergen, who was head of communications, went on actually to advise President Clinton as well as President Reagan. David always said, you've got to get everything out. You've got to get it out now. And as unpleasant as it is, whether you're an office holder or a family member, as unpleasant as that suggestion or recommendation might be, time and time again, it's proven true. Because if you hold back, ultimately the information comes out. It tends to come out at the worst possible time. Now it's going to be dragged into the middle of these midterm elections, which are not going to. It's not going to be helpful to the Biden administration and to Democrats in Congress. It just won't. And while it may pale in comparison to other, dastardly deeds by others, the fact is this story should have been dealt with some time ago. Everything should have come out. And while we say that President Biden wasn't involved, members of my party are frankly going to speculate, and as long as there's information that's being withheld as to whether he knew something or didn't know something. And that's frankly not really good for the nation. So maybe there's a teaching moment here that whether you're a member of the administration or a member of the family, the highest level threshold here that we all signed on to when we go to the White House is don't engage in anything that has the appearance of conflict. That's a pretty high standard, but frankly, if you adhere to it, it keeps you out of a lot of trouble down the road.
Al Fromm, Craig Fuller, thank you so much indeed. We will see you next week.